The cold evening air carried the faint scent of rain as Emma Carter stepped out of the cab and onto the gravel driveway of Fairview Estate. She pulled her thin coat tighter around her shoulders and adjusted the stiff collar of her uniform. Tonight would be like many others, she told herself. Another event at the mansion where excess was on display, and Emma was merely part of the backdrop. Fairview Estate loomed before her, a sprawling architectural marvel of marble and glass. Its grand facade glittered under the soft glow of strategically placed lights, while laughter and music spilled out from the open doors. Emma had worked as a server for years, catering to the whims of the wealthy, but there was something uniquely intimidating about Victor Ashford's parties. They weren't just lavish. They were performances designed to showcase power, wealth, and control. Emma took a deep breath, steadied her nerves, and walked toward the main entrance. Inside, the mansion was even more breathtaking. Marble floors stretched endlessly beneath towering ceilings adorned with crystal chandeliers. Elegant guests dressed in designer gowns and tailored suits floated about with champagne glasses in hand, their conversations an orchestra of murmured tones and forced laughter. Emma didn't belong here, and she knew it. As she passed through the grand hall, her eyes wandered over the exquisite decor. Gold-accented furniture, priceless paintings, and floral arrangements the size of small trees filled every corner. It was a world so far removed from her own. At home, her 6-year-old son Noah was likely curled up on their second-hand couch, watching his favorite cartoons, blissfully unaware of the sacrifices Emma made to keep their modest apartment running. The thought brought a pang of guilt, but also determination. Everything she did, every exhausting hour she spent serving these people, was for him. Victor Ashford's name was whispered in reverence and sometimes fear among the staff. Once known for his charm and generosity, Victor had become infamous for his cold demeanor and sharp tongue following the loss of his wife, Amelia. Grief had hardened him, turning him into a man who demanded perfection and wielded his wealth like a weapon. Emma had yet to interact with him directly, but she had seen enough to know that his reputation was well earned. The evening passed in a blur of silver trays, spilled wine, and polite smiles. Emma worked her way through the crowd with practiced ease, balancing trays of hors d'oeuvres and bottles of vintage champagne. Every now and then, she caught snippets of conversation, business deals, gossip about affairs, and shallow remarks about art and fashion. It was a hollow world, but Emma kept her head down, focused on her job. Toward the end of the evening, she found herself near the main staircase. From her vantage point, she could see Victor standing at the top, surveying the scene below like a king observing his court. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored black suit, his silver hair slicked back with precision. His expression was unreadable, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd with a mixture of disdain and boredom. A soft chime signaled the start of a toast, and Victor descended the staircase with calculated grace. The room fell silent as he reached the bottom, raising a glass. "To success," he said, his voice commanding and devoid of warmth. "May it continue to favor those who have earned it." The crowd erupted in applause, but Emma couldn't help feeling a chill run down her spine. There was something unnerving about the man. He moved through the crowd afterward, exchanging brief pleasantries, but his presence felt oppressive. As he neared her section of the room, Emma ducked her head and moved quickly to avoid his notice. Later, as she cleaned up empty glasses and discarded napkins, Emma overheard two guests speaking in hushed tones near the fireplace. "Did you hear about Ashford's new plans?" one of them whispered. "He's turning the old West Wing into a ballroom. The man's insatiable. Everything has to be bigger, better, more grandiose." "Of course," the other replied, laughing quietly. "Victor Ashford doesn't throw parties for fun. They're power plays. He's just showing off." Emma bit her lip and focused on her work, pretending not to hear. She couldn't afford to care about the politics of the rich. Her priority was simple: get through the night, collect her paycheck, and go home to Noah. As the clock struck midnight, the party began to wind down. Emma made her way to the staff quarters to change out of her uniform. Her body ached from hours of standing and carrying trays, but her mind was already on the bus ride home and the bedtime story she had promised to read to Noah. Just as she reached for her coat, she heard a voice behind her. "You there?" Emma froze. Turning slowly, she found herself face to face with Victor Ashford. His piercing gaze bore into her, and for a moment she felt as though she had done something wrong. "Yes, sir?" she managed, her voice steady despite the rapid thumping of her heart. Victor didn't respond immediately. He looked her up and down, his expression unreadable. Then, with a curt nod, he said, "You did well tonight. Don't disappoint me next time." Emma blinked, unsure how to respond. Before she could find the words, Victor turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the empty hallway. Her pulse was still racing as she grabbed her coat and hurried outside. The night air was sharp and cold, but as Emma walked toward the bus stop, she felt an odd mixture of relief and unease. She had managed to get through another night at Fairview Estate, but something told her this was only the beginning. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting an amber glow across the city as Emma stepped off the bus, weary but relieved to be home. Their modest apartment stood in stark contrast to the grandeur of Fairview Estate, yet its small comforts, like Noah's enthusiastic hug as he ran to the door, made it feel like a palace. After dinner and a bedtime story, Emma settled onto the couch, her thoughts drifting back to the mansion. It wasn't the chandeliers or the sprawling marble halls that lingered in her mind, but something far more unexpected: a piano. The image of it came unbidden, gleaming under the light of the chandelier, its black finish polished to perfection. Emma had passed it earlier in the evening while serving trays of hors d'oeuvres. The sight had stopped her in her tracks, her pulse quickening with a longing she hadn't felt in years. Music had once been her world. Before life's hardships took over, Emma had spent countless hours at the piano, losing herself in melodies that spoke what words could not. It had been her refuge, her joy, until it became another sacrifice on the altar of survival. The memory haunted her into the next evening when she returned to Fairview Estate for another event. As the crowd filled the grand hall, Emma moved through the opulent space with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to blend into the background. Her uniform pressed, her smile polite but distant, she passed unnoticed among the elite. But tonight, her eyes kept drifting toward the corner where the piano stood, a magnificent instrument, regal in its presence. She hesitated, torn between duty and desire. The allure of the piano tugged at her, a magnetic pull she couldn't ignore. During a rare, quiet moment, Emma found herself standing before it. Her fingers hovered over the keys, not quite touching, as if the weight of her past held them back. The first time Emma had played a piano, she had been 6 years old, the same age Noah was now. Her parents couldn't afford lessons, but an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, had taken her under her wing. Emma could still recall the warm scent of Mrs. Jenkins' home, the creak of the wooden bench, and the encouragement that filled the air as she stumbled over her first scales. Those lessons had opened a world of possibility, one where Emma's fingers danced effortlessly over the keys, telling stories through music. "Mommy, can you teach me to play the piano someday?" Noah had asked just last week, his wide eyes full of curiosity. At the time, she had smiled wistfully and said, "Maybe someday." She hadn't played in years. What could she possibly teach him now? Standing before the piano, Emma's heart ached with the weight of what she had lost. Before she knew it, her fingers grazed the edge of the keys. A single note broke the silence, soft and haunting. She froze, glancing around to see if anyone had noticed. But the grand hall buzzed with laughter and conversation, and no one spared her a glance. She pressed another key, then another, the faint notes barely audible above the hum of the crowd. Memories flooded back, bittersweet and powerful. Her hands remembered, even if her heart had tried to forget. Lost in the moment, she didn't notice the figure approaching from across the room. Victor Ashford, holding a glass of wine, stopped mid-conversation as his gaze landed on her. His sharp features softened, his eyes narrowing, as if trying to place the strange mix of vulnerability and determination in her expression. The spell broke when a sharp voice behind her barked, "What are you doing?" Emma flinched, spinning around to see a senior staff member glaring at her. Flustered, she stepped back, mumbling an apology. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "You're here to work, not to fool around," the man snapped, gesturing for her to get back to serving. Emma nodded quickly, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. As she hurried away, she felt Victor's eyes on her, but she didn't dare look back. The rest of the night dragged on, and Emma kept her head down, determined to avoid further mishaps. When the event finally ended, she collected her things and made her way outside. The cold air was a welcome reprieve from the stifling opulence of the mansion. As she waited for the bus, her thoughts returned to the piano and the brief, stolen moment of connection. The longing didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger, echoing in her chest like the faint notes she had played. She couldn't explain why the memory of the piano held such power over her. It was just a thing, an object, but it felt like a part of herself she had long buried had been awakened. By the time Emma reached home, the house was quiet. Noah was fast asleep, his small frame curled under a patchwork blanket. Emma stood in the doorway of his room, watching him for a long moment. "Maybe someday," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. But as she lay in bed that night, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, Emma made a promise to herself. One way or another, she would find her way back to the piano. Not just for her sake, but for Noah's, for the dreams he hadn't even known he'd inherited. It was a quiet vow, one spoken into the darkness. But for the first time in years, Emma felt the faint flicker of hope. The following week passed in a blur of routines: work, dinner, and the occasional quiet moment with Noah, who had been bubbling with excitement about their upcoming weekend plans. As the weekend approached, however, Emma's thoughts drifted, unwillingly, back to the mansion, to the piano, to Victor Ashford. She hadn't expected the memory to linger this long, and certainly not with such intensity. The night at Fairview Estate had been a fleeting moment, one that should have been buried beneath the tedium of her daily life. Yet, there it was again, an echo in her mind that wouldn't be silenced. Her fingers itched to touch the keys again, to feel the music pour from her like it had in her youth. But that felt impossible, especially in the presence of someone like Victor. She had seen him only briefly after their interaction by the piano, his sharp gaze lingering on her as he had spoken to the other guests. His expression had been unreadable, his demeanor distant and cold. Yet, it had not gone unnoticed by Emma, the way he had observed her, the slight narrowing of his eyes as if sizing her up. The thought made her stomach twist uneasily. She didn't know much about him, but what she had seen so far only reinforced the rumors, the whispers of his cruelty, his coldness, his obsession with power. And yet, here she was, still unable to shake the feeling that her brief encounter with him meant something more. On the day of the party, Emma dressed in her best, though she felt far from glamorous. She adjusted the sleeves of her black dress, the fabric smooth against her skin, but the weight of the evening pressed on her shoulders like an invisible burden. Noah had insisted on helping her pick out her outfit, his tiny hands determined as he dug through her closet. "You look so pretty, Mommy," he had said with an innocent grin that made Emma's heart swell. Emma had smiled, but the unease in her chest hadn't dissipated. She wasn't sure what she expected from the night, but she was certain it wasn't an invitation from Victor Ashford himself. As the car pulled up to the grand entrance of Fairview Estate, her pulse quickened. The mansion stood even more imposing in the dark, its towering columns like sentinels watching over the festivities. Inside, the air was thick with the hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the rich scent of expensive wine. This was a world Emma had long learned to navigate, but tonight, the weight of it felt heavier than ever. Noah clung to her hand as they stepped into the grand hall. He looked up at the towering chandeliers with wide-eyed wonder, his small body dwarfed by the extravagance that surrounded them. Emma smiled down at him, but her eyes kept flickering toward the piano in the corner of the room. It was there again, glimmering beneath the lights, a beacon of longing she couldn't ignore. Victor's presence was unmistakable. He was the center of every room, his every movement commanding attention. He glided through the crowd, effortlessly drawing people in with a sharp smile, a well-timed laugh, or a subtle gesture. He was a master of control, his icy demeanor a shield he wore like armor. Emma felt him before she saw him, his sharp gaze catching hers across the room, pinning her in place for a brief moment before he turned to greet a group of guests. But then, unexpectedly, he was standing in front of her. "Emma," Victor said, his voice smooth but laced with an unmistakable edge. "I'm glad you could make it." Emma stood frozen, unsure how to respond. She could feel the weight of his eyes on her, calculating, studying her every move. She managed a polite smile, even as a knot of anxiety twisted in her stomach. "It's an impressive gathering," she replied, her voice more confident than she felt. Noah, sensing her tension, tugged gently at her sleeve. "Mommy, can we go see the piano?" he asked innocently, his wide eyes hopeful. Emma's heart softened as she looked down at him, the sight of his innocent excitement soothing some of her nerves. "Of course, sweetheart. Let's take a look," she said, her voice steadier now. She was about to pull Noah along when she heard Victor speak again. "You like the piano, don't you?" His voice was low, almost too casual, but Emma caught the edge of something in his tone, something that made her spine stiffen. Emma's hand paused on Noah's, her heart racing. She glanced at Victor, trying to keep her expression neutral. "I do," she said carefully, "but I'm not much of a player these days." Victor smiled, a thin, calculating smile that didn't reach his eyes. "What a shame. Perhaps you'll play for us one day," he said, the suggestion hanging in the air between them like an unspoken challenge. Emma's throat tightened. She had no intention of playing for anyone, least of all Victor Ashford. The thought of being the center of attention, performing for a room full of strangers who held power over her, was unbearable. But she couldn't very well refuse him. She had learned long ago that refusing the whims of the wealthy was a luxury she couldn't afford. Before she could protest, Victor's gaze swept across the room, and his voice rang out, effortlessly drawing the attention of everyone in the vicinity. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his tone rich with authority, "we are fortunate tonight to have a special guest among us. Emma Carter, a talented woman with a rare gift. Tonight, she will grace us with a performance." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd as all eyes turned to Emma. Her breath caught in her throat, her legs suddenly feeling weak beneath her. Noah squeezed her hand, oblivious to the pressure that now surrounded them. He looked up at her with wide-eyed excitement. Emma felt trapped. There was no way out of this. No polite way to decline without risking the wrath of Victor and his guests. She glanced nervously toward the piano, a deep ache in her chest as the overwhelming weight of the situation settled over her. Victor's gaze, cold and unreadable, was fixed firmly on her now. His lips curled in a faint smile, but there was no warmth in it. Only a challenge. It was as though he was daring her to refuse, daring her to show weakness. "Go on, Emma," he urged, his voice deceptively gentle. "The piano is waiting." In that moment, Emma realized there was no choice but to comply. Her pulse raced as she reluctantly made her way to the piano, her legs feeling like lead. With every step, the room seemed to grow quieter, the weight of 100 eyes pressing in on her. She tried to steady her breath, to regain the composure she had worked so hard to maintain. Noah's small, encouraging smile was the only thing that kept her from turning around and running. Emma felt the eyes of the entire room on her as she stepped toward the piano. Each click of her heels against the marble floor sounded too loud, too deliberate. The grand hall, with its towering pillars, crystal chandeliers, and opulent furnishings, seemed to close in around her as though it was conspiring to remind her just how out of place she truly was. The faint buzz of conversation died down to a near silence, save for the occasional clink of glass. Victor's invitation hung in the air like an unspoken command. She couldn't back out now. The eyes of the elite, those sharp, calculating gazes that had long been used to controlling and belittling, all fixed on her. Emma felt a chill run down her spine as she approached the piano. Noah's grip on her hand tightened, his small fingers reassuring her that she was not alone in this moment. She glanced down at him. His innocent excitement contrasted sharply with the tension tightening her chest. He couldn't possibly understand the magnitude of what was about to happen. How his mother, a humble woman who had once poured her heart into music, now stood in a grand hall, about to be scrutinized by the rich and powerful, her every move dissected. The piano was just as magnificent as she had remembered. Its glossy black surface reflected the dazzling light of the chandelier above, its polished keys beckoning her like an old friend. But where once the touch of the piano had felt like an embrace, tonight it felt like a distant memory, something she wasn't sure she could reach again. She hadn't played in so long. Her fingers felt stiff as she hovered over the keys, unsure of where to begin. Victor's gaze never left her. She could feel it burning into her skin, cool and assessing, almost like he was daring her to fail. The other guests had fallen into an expectant hush, waiting for her to play. Her palms grew clammy, her heart pounding in her chest. The fear of making a mistake, of being ridiculed, overwhelmed her. The silence in the room stretched on, making her feel smaller and smaller with each passing second. Her fingers, trembling slightly, found their way to the first few notes, tentative and unsure. She could almost hear the collective breath of the crowd held in anticipation. A single note rang out, loud and pure. Emma's breath hitched as the sound resonated through the room, echoing off the marble walls. It was as if the note had shattered the silence, but the weight of that silence quickly returned, pressing against her. She drew in a breath and pressed another key and another, trying to steady herself. The music was coming back to her, but slowly, so slowly, as though her hands had forgotten the rhythm of her heart. Her fingers stuttered over the keys, each note like a fragile step along a path she hadn't walked in years. She didn't have to look up to know that every eye in the room was on her. The pressure of it was suffocating. For a moment, her mind went blank, the familiar melody slipping from her grasp. She glanced at Noah, who was standing beside her, his small hand still holding hers tightly. He was watching her with wide, trusting eyes, his little face full of innocent encouragement. His gaze was unwavering, full of belief. In that moment, his presence gave her strength. He didn't see her as someone out of place, someone who didn't belong in this room. To him, she was simply his mother, the woman who could do anything, the one who would always be there. With a deep breath, Emma steadied her hands. She took one more look at Noah, and then, without thinking, let her fingers glide across the piano keys. The melody began to flow more freely now, the familiar, comforting strains of the music filling the air, erasing the silence, banishing the fear. As her fingers danced across the keys, the music began to take on a life of its own. She lost herself in the rhythm, in the beauty of the sound, as though the years of distance between her and the piano had never existed. It was as though the music had always been there, waiting for her to remember it. The crowd fell completely silent, their rapt attention focused entirely on her. The tension in Emma's chest slowly unwound as the notes filled the room, the music becoming a shield, protecting her from the harsh, scrutinizing stares. Each key seemed to bring her closer to the woman she used to be, the woman who could express herself through music, who could speak her heart without words. Victor remained where he stood, his gaze never wavering from her. But there was something different in his expression now. His eyes were not cold or calculating, but something else, something she couldn't quite decipher. He was watching her with a quiet intensity, his lips pressed into a thin line. The way he studied her, so intently, reminded her of a man trying to unravel a mystery, but one that was just out of reach. As the final chords of the piece lingered in the air, Emma's hands trembled, the last note hanging in the silence like a fragile thread. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to breathe, to let the weight of the moment settle in. For the first time that evening, the fear was gone. The silence in the room was deafening. Then, slowly, almost hesitantly, a few guests began to clap, and within seconds, the entire room erupted in applause. Emma opened her eyes, blinking in surprise. She had forgotten how it felt to be the center of attention in such a way. The sound of clapping, the murmurs of praise, made her heart race. Her hands still trembled as she turned away from the piano, but the applause didn't stop. It seemed to fill the room, bouncing off the walls in waves. Victor was at the back of the crowd, standing perfectly still, his expression unreadable. He didn't applaud, but he didn't move either. His eyes were fixed on her, the intensity of his gaze almost palpable. Noah was the first to reach her, his small hands pulling at her sleeve. "Mommy, that was amazing! You were so good!" he exclaimed, his face lit with joy and pride. Emma smiled down at him, her chest swelling with pride. For him, the applause didn't matter. He saw her not as a performer, but as his mother. To him, she had already won. But Emma knew, deep down, that something had changed. The music had been her escape, her victory in that moment, but the world around her, the world Victor had pulled her into, was far from forgiving. The game had just begun. The applause seemed endless, echoing in Emma's ears as she stepped away from the piano, her hands still trembling from the intensity of the moment. She kept her eyes trained on Noah, who was beaming up at her, his small face full of admiration. His presence, innocent and pure, grounded her, as if in the midst of all the wealth and power in the room, his unwavering love was the only thing that truly mattered. But even his bright eyes couldn't completely chase away the cold knot of tension in her chest. Emma's pulse raced as she tried to compose herself, her heart still pounding with the rush of performing for the crowd. She had played with all her heart, and the music had given her a brief respite from the weight of the world. But now, standing in the center of that grand hall, the reality of her situation returned with a force she couldn't ignore. The murmurs of approval from the guests continued to swirl around her, some soft and polite, others filled with genuine admiration. They were kind, but Emma could feel the underlying judgment behind their praise, the quiet assessments of her place in this world that didn't truly belong to her. She had been invited here as a novelty, a spectacle, a woman from the lower class brought in to entertain the wealthy elite. And no matter how beautiful the music had been, she would always be the outsider. But it wasn't just the guests that made her feel out of place. Victor's presence loomed over her like a shadow, cold and oppressive. He stood at the back of the room, a figure of power, his tall frame unmoving as he observed her with that same unsettling gaze. His eyes were dark, unreadable, and they seemed to pierce through her, as though he was searching for something hidden beneath the surface. Emma wanted to look away, to escape the weight of his scrutiny, but she couldn't. She couldn't tear her eyes from his, even as she felt the tension in the room shift. Victor's lips curved into a slight, almost imperceptible smile, but it was the kind of smile that sent a chill down Emma's spine. There was no warmth in it, no genuine pleasure in her performance. It was a smile of calculation, as though he had just checked something off in his mind. And then, in a voice that carried easily across the room, he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his tone smooth, almost most playful, "I hope you've enjoyed this little surprise performance. But I'm sure you all know that there's more to Emma than just her talent for music." Emma's breath hitched as her stomach twisted in unease. There was something in his words, something he wasn't saying aloud, that made her skin prickle with discomfort. He continued, his voice drawing the room's attention even more sharply. "We all know that talent can be fleeting, but true character, that's something worth testing. Emma, my dear, I have an idea." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She could feel the weight of the room's gaze settling on her once more, the anticipation thick in the air. What did he mean by testing her character? Was this some kind of twisted game to him? And why was she the one in the spotlight? Victor's eyes never left hers as he spoke, his gaze now sharp with something more than mere curiosity. "I think we should make this evening even more interesting. After all, talent is one thing, but willpower is something else entirely." He took a step toward her, his movement slow and deliberate. The way he approached her felt almost predatory, like a lion circling its prey. His smile widened, but the cruelty behind it was unmistakable. "I propose a challenge, Emma," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear the edge in his words. "Since you're so good at entertaining us, why don't you prove your worth by performing again? Only this time, I want to see more than just a pretty song. I want to see how well you can handle pressure. I want to see if you have the endurance to keep going, if you can entertain us for as long as we wish." The room went silent again, but this time, the silence wasn't filled with admiration or anticipation. It was filled with something darker, something more unsettling. Emma's mind raced. What was he asking of her? It wasn't just another song. It was a challenge, a test of her endurance, her ability to entertain him and his guests for an indefinite period of time. She could sense the eyes of the crowd on her, the way they waited for her response, as though they were all expecting her to accept. Her hands clenched at her sides. Was this some kind of twisted game, a way for Victor to show just how much power he had over her? Or was he genuinely interested in her abilities, in what she could offer? Either way, the challenge felt more like a trap than an opportunity. Victor's smile never faltered, but there was something cold in his eyes, something calculating, like he was waiting to see if she would fall into his trap. Emma swallowed hard, her throat dry. She didn't know how to respond, but there was no denying the pressure mounting in her chest. She had already been humiliated once, had already been thrust into the spotlight in front of people who didn't know her or care about her. But this was different. This was not just about playing a song for the enjoyment of the guests. This was about proving herself to Victor, about submitting to his will and showing the room that she could endure whatever challenge he set before her. And the worst part? She wasn't sure she had a choice. Noah looked up at her, his eyes wide, and for a moment, Emma's heart cracked. He couldn't understand what was happening, why she was being asked to do something so strange and uncomfortable. All he knew was that he wanted to be proud of her. He wanted her to succeed. Emma looked back at Victor, the weight of the room pressing down on her. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. This was not just about music. It was about control, power. And she was starting to realize that Victor didn't just want to test her talent. He wanted to break her. But she wasn't ready to give him that satisfaction. She had faced so many challenges in her life already. She had survived hardships that would have broken someone else. She wasn't about to let him break her now. With a deep breath, Emma straightened her back, looking directly at Victor. The smile on his face never wavered, but she could see the flicker of surprise in his eyes when she spoke, her voice firm and steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. "I'll play again," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "But only on my terms. If you want me to play, you'll let me decide when it ends." Victor's eyes narrowed, and for the first time that evening, there was a hint of something deeper, something dangerous in his gaze. He studied her for a long moment, weighing her response. And then, to her surprise, he smiled, a genuine smile this time, though it was still tinged with something unsettling. "Very well," he said, his voice laced with amusement. "Let's see what you've got, Emma Carter. Let's see if you can handle the pressure." The challenge had been set, and Emma knew that her true test was just beginning. The weight of the challenge pressed down on Emma as she walked toward the piano. Her heart pounded in her chest, each step echoing in her mind like a drumbeat, amplifying the tension in the air. The room was silent now, all eyes trained on her, the guests waiting with bated breath for her to perform again. The previous applause still lingered in her ears, but it now felt distant, faint. The crowd's expectations had shifted. This wasn't just about her talent anymore. This was about survival, about keeping her dignity intact in front of a room full of strangers, most of whom would never truly see her for who she was. Emma's hands were still trembling as she approached the piano, the cold ivory keys gleaming under the chandelier's light. She had played for herself once, lost in the music, finding peace in every note. But this was different. Now she was performing for Victor, for his guests, for their judgment. It was a performance not just of music, but of character. She had to show them that she could endure whatever they threw at her, that she wasn't some pawn to be toyed with. She glanced back at Noah, still clinging to her side, his innocent face full of trust and pride. Her chest tightened at the sight of him, a reminder of why she had to stay strong. For him, for their future. He needed her to be more than just a mother. He needed her to be someone who could rise above this, someone who could take control of her own fate. With a deep breath, Emma placed her fingers on the keys. The cool touch of the ivory calmed her nerves, and she allowed herself a moment of stillness before beginning. The room fell even quieter, the murmurs of the crowd ceasing as she started to play. Her fingers moved gently at first, testing the keys, feeling the familiar contours beneath her touch. It was as though the music, so long dormant in her heart, flowed back to her in an instant. The first notes were soft, hesitant, but with each chord, her confidence grew. The sounds filled the air, swirling around her like a gentle breeze, and for a moment, she was lost in the music again. She could almost forget that she was standing in the center of a gilded cage, under the watchful eyes of a man who had tried to break her spirit. Instead, she focused on the melody, letting it take her away. Her fingers moved more freely now, led aloft, the music growing in complexity and emotion. Each note was a declaration of her resilience, her refusal to be diminished by the circumstances that had brought her here. She wasn't just playing for the guests. She was playing for herself, for Noah, for the woman she had once dreamed of becoming before life had pushed her into the shadows. The music swelled, filling the vast hall, and with each passing second, Emma felt a surge of power. The room was still, but the sound of the piano was alive, alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. Her hands danced across the keys, each note building upon the last, more assured, more certain. She played as though the music were a lifeline, pulling her from the depths of doubt and fear, lifting her higher with every measure. The guests watched in rapt silence, some with their mouths slightly agape, others leaning forward in their seats, entranced by the sheer beauty of the music. Emma couldn't see them anymore, not their expectant eyes, not their judgments. All she could see was the music, unfolding before her like a story she had to tell. It was the only language she knew that could speak to her soul, the only way she could express what words failed to convey. For what felt like hours, she played, lost in the rhythm, the melody, the emotions she poured into every note. The pressure of the challenge melted away as the music took on a life of its own. She felt it coursing through her, through every fiber of her being, pushing her, urging her to keep going. And then, just as the last note floated into the air, Emma's hands slowed, the final chord reverberating through the room. Silence followed. Profound, deep silence. It was as though the world had stopped spinning for a moment, suspended in the wake of the performance. Emma's chest heaved with the effort, her heart still racing, but she didn't look at the crowd. She didn't need to. She had done it. She had shown them who she was, who she could be, when given the chance. The silence stretched on, thick with anticipation, and Emma began to feel the familiar discomfort of being watched, analyzed, judged. But this time, it didn't matter. The music had been her voice, and in that voice, she had said everything she needed to say. Finally, the stillness was broken, and the room erupted into applause. The sound was deafening, the guests clapping with enthusiasm, some even standing in appreciation. Emma stood frozen, her hands still hovering over the keys, the weight of the moment sinking in. This was different. This wasn't just polite applause. It was genuine admiration. Her fingers had spoken to them, to their hearts, in a way that nothing else had. As the clapping died down, Emma slowly stood, her legs feeling weak beneath her, but she didn't care. She had done it. She had proven herself. Victor's figure appeared at the edge of her vision, moving toward her through the crowd. He walked with the kind of confidence that only someone like him could possess, his every step deliberate, measured. The crowd parted for him as he approached, and Emma felt her stomach tighten once again. She had just given everything she had, but she knew this moment wasn't over yet. Victor stopped in front of her, his eyes dark, unreadable. The applause was still echoing in the background, but his presence was all-consuming. "Well done," he said, his voice low and smooth. "I didn't expect you to rise to the challenge like that." Emma's breath caught in her throat, but she held his gaze steadily, refusing to let him see her uncertainty. She had played for herself, not for him, not for anyone else. Her eyes flashed with a quiet defiance. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "But I wasn't playing for you, Victor." He raised an eyebrow, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "No, I suppose not. But you played as if you were fighting for something, as if you were fighting for yourself." Emma didn't answer. She didn't need to. The music had already spoken for her, louder than words ever could. Victor's smile faded slightly, replaced by something that could almost be called respect. But there was something else in his eyes, something darker. "You've surprised me, Emma. I underestimated you. But now," he paused, letting the tension build, "I think we've only just begun." Emma swallowed hard, a cold shiver running down her spine. She didn't know what game he was playing, but she knew she had to keep her guard up. She had won this round, but the war was far from over. With a final glance at her, Victor turned and walked away, his figure melting into the crowd. Emma stood still for a moment longer, her breath still coming fast, the weight of the moment sinking in. She had taken back some of her power, but the next challenge was already looming. And she wasn't sure what it would cost her. But for now, she had triumphed. And that at least was enough. The days following the performance were a blur of whispered conversations and sideways glances. Emma couldn't escape the feeling that something had shifted in the way people saw her. But the tension in the air was almost palpable. She was still processing the overwhelming emotions that had flooded her when the music had taken over, but the external world wasn't letting her forget that this was only the beginning. There was still much more to face, much more at stake. Victor's presence had loomed over the mansion since that night, but despite his apparent interest in her performance, he kept his distance, leaving Emma to wonder what his true intentions were. She knew better than to let her guard down around him. His words, while laced with what seemed like respect, always carried an underlying edge, a warning she couldn't ignore. But there was no denying that something had changed between them after that night. Something unspoken, something that might not be entirely bad. It was late one evening when Emma received the message, a simple text from Victor asking to meet her. No specifics, just a time and place, a small cafe she didn't recognize. Emma's fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, her mind racing. After everything that had happened, what could he want now? What was the real motive behind this unexpected request? Despite the caution swirling inside her, she couldn't help but feel a strange curiosity. The intrigue was stronger than the skepticism. What was Victor Ashford thinking? What was it about her performance that had affected him so deeply? After a few moments of deliberation, she sent a quick reply, agreeing to meet him. She had nothing to lose, after all. The worst he could do was further expose the power dynamics that already existed between them, but she had already seen his cruelty. Maybe it was time to face whatever was coming next. The cafe he'd mentioned was small and cozy, tucked away on a quiet street, a far cry from the extravagant ballroom where she had played. Its low lights and casual atmosphere immediately put her on edge, an odd contrast to everything she had experienced under Victor's control. She felt like an intruder here, like a reminder of what he had left behind, the cold walls of his mansion, and the mask he wore for the world. Emma arrived early, choosing a corner seat where she could keep an eye on the door. Her nerves were frayed, but she couldn't allow herself to appear vulnerable. She was determined to face whatever conversation awaited her with composure. Victor arrived promptly, his tall figure entering the cafe with the same calculated grace that had been so apparent at the mansion. There was no entourage, no show of wealth, just him and the air of dominance he seemed to carry wherever he went. Emma's eyes flickered to the man she had once thought of as distant, a mere figure of power, but who, in some way, had become entwined in her life in a way she hadn't expected. When Victor spotted her, he nodded in acknowledgement, the ghost of a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "Emma," he greeted her, taking a seat across from her. His tone was soft but steady, an almost disarming change from his usual intensity. "Thank you for meeting me." She nodded, her gaze never leaving his face. "I wasn't sure what this was about. You made your intentions clear at the party, Victor. I'm curious about what has changed since then." Victor leaned back in his chair, his hands folded on the table. The familiar arrogance was still there, but there was something else in his expression now, an openness that was unfamiliar to her. For a brief moment, Emma almost forgot that she was sitting across from a man who had once been a stranger to compassion. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice low but resolute, "for what I put you through." Emma blinked in surprise. This was not the Victor she knew, the man who had used his power to dominate and manipulate, the man who had seemed incapable of acknowledging any weakness. She leaned forward slightly, studying him. "You owe me an apology?" Victor met her gaze, his eyes dark, but there was something vulnerable in them that she hadn't expected. "I didn't want to admit it at the time, but I was wrong. What I tried to do that night, I had planned to humiliate you. But your music, it changed something in me." He paused, his gaze dropping to the table as if he couldn't quite bring himself to say more. Emma took a deep breath, her emotions in turmoil. She had been prepared for a confrontation, for more of the same coldness. But this was different. She had been angry, hurt even, but now she could see the sincerity in his eyes. She didn't know what to make of it. "I never wanted to hurt you," Victor continued, his voice growing quieter. "I thought I could control everything, manipulate it all. But you, Emma, you've been through more than anyone could imagine. And yet, you didn't let that stop you from doing something incredible." His voice trailed off as he looked up at her again, and she saw something new in his eyes, a glimmer of respect, maybe even regret. Emma swallowed hard, her mind racing. This wasn't what she had expected, but in a strange way, it was almost a relief. The walls she had built around herself, the fortress of self-reliance she'd constructed to survive, began to feel less impenetrable. There was a softness here, a moment of vulnerability that she hadn't anticipated. "I've always believed that people don't change," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "That you either show your true nature or you hide behind masks forever." Victor's expression shifted, a flicker of something like sadness passing across his face. "I don't blame you for thinking that. I wore a mask for a long time, Emma, but I think I've begun to take it off. And maybe that's because of you." Her heart raced, and for the first time, she found herself questioning everything she had assumed about him. Could Victor Ashford, the man who had built his empire on control and power, truly be changing? Or was this just another manipulation, a calculated move to bend her to his will? She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I don't know what you expect from me, Victor, but I'm not someone who forgets easily. I can't just ignore the things you've done, the way you've treated people." She paused, searching for the right words. "But I appreciate your apology, and I don't know what comes next for either of us, but I'll need to see if this is real." Victor nodded slowly, his face unreadable once again. "I understand, but I want you to know this, Emma. I'm not the man I was before, and if you'll allow me to prove it to you, I'll show you a different side of me, one that isn't about power or control, one that's about making amends." Emma's heart twisted with a mix of skepticism and hope. She didn't know if she could trust him, not yet anyway. But there was something in his voice, something that made her wonder if he was telling the truth. For the first time in a long while, Emma felt a flicker of hope, a hope that maybe, just maybe, people could change. But whether she was ready to believe that would take time. The days after the meeting with Victor were strangely quiet. Emma had expected the usual noise, the gossip, the whispers, the underlying tension, but instead there was only silence. Victor's apology still lingered in her mind, but it was impossible to ignore the remnants of distrust that had built up over the years. She wasn't foolish enough to think that one conversation could erase everything he had done. But as the days passed, she found herself thinking more and more about his offer, about what he had said and how he had said it. She didn't want to believe it, didn't want to hope for something that could easily be taken away. But something about Victor's change, his willingness to expose vulnerability for the first time, was hard to dismiss. Then, just as Emma was beginning to find a semblance of normalcy again, the message came. This time, with an offer that was both unexpected and intriguing. It was an invitation from Victor himself, accompanied by the promise of something that could change her life. The message was simple, yet it held the weight of something much bigger. "I want you to play regularly at my events. Your music, it brought something to my gatherings that was missing. I want to create a different atmosphere, more meaningful, more genuine. If you're willing, I'd like you to be a part of it, and I'll make sure you're compensated fairly. This is not just about music. It's about creating something that matters. Will you help me?" Emma stared at the screen for a long time, her fingers hovering over the reply button. She had never been one to jump at opportunities that seemed too good to be true, but this felt different. There was something about the tone of his message, something in the words that made her hesitate. Could it be possible that Victor Ashford, the man who had once used his wealth and power to control, was genuinely interested in creating something meaningful? Her instincts screamed at her to be careful, to hold her ground. But then she thought of Noah, how much she wanted to give him a better life, a life where he didn't have to grow up in the shadows of her struggles. And she thought about her own dreams, the ones that had been buried so deep beneath the weight of reality that they almost seemed like distant memories. Music had always been her escape, her one constant through every hardship. Could this be the chance to reclaim that part of herself? To use her music for something bigger than herself? With a deep breath, Emma tapped out a response, her fingers shaking slightly. "I'll consider it, but only if the intention is genuine. I won't be part of anything that just feeds ego or creates more harm. If we're going to do this, it has to be real." She hit send, her heart pounding as she wondered what he would say next. The reply came quickly. It was simple, but its sincerity was palpable. "I understand. And I promise, this is different. I'm willing to prove it to you. Meet me next week, and we'll discuss the details." And so, Emma found herself standing once again before Victor Ashford, But this time, something was different. There was no lavish mansion, no ballroom full of people with hidden motives. Instead, they met in a small, quiet office, an understated space with little more than a desk, a few chairs, and a window that looked out over the city skyline. It was a far cry from the gilded cages she had once been confined to, and yet it felt like a breath of fresh air. This was the beginning of something new, something raw and real. Victor greeted her with a polite but earnest smile as she entered the room. He motioned for her to take a seat across from him. The atmosphere between them was more relaxed than she had expected. He didn't seem like the man who had orchestrated so many power games. Instead, he appeared focused, intent on making this work. "Thank you for coming, Emma," Victor said, his voice calm and sincere. "I know this is a big ask, but I've been thinking about it a lot, and I believe this is the right step forward, not just for my events, but for me, for us." Emma raised an eyebrow but stayed silent. She needed him to explain himself further before she made any judgment. She wasn't ready to take his words at face value, not yet. "I want to create something that goes beyond the usual parties," Victor continued. "I want to use these gatherings as a way to give back. We've built a name for ourselves, but I've realized that we've done little to truly make an impact. I want to change that, and I think your music can help us do that." Emma leaned back in her chair, considering his words. Part of her wanted to dismiss it as another one of his schemes. But then she thought about all the people she could help, all the causes she could champion if this opportunity was real. "What are you asking of me exactly?" she asked carefully, her eyes searching his face for any hint of deception. "I want you to be the heart of these events," Victor said. "You'll perform at every one of them, yes, but more than that, I want you to help shape the direction. We'll partner with local charities, raise awareness for causes that matter. I want these events to stand for something." He paused, his gaze locking with hers. "And, if you're willing, I want you to help me with the vision. Help me build something that can last, something that can actually make a difference." Emma's heart beat faster as she processed his words. This wasn't just an offer for money or fame. This was something deeper, something with the potential to make a real difference in the world. "I'm not interested in playing for the sake of entertainment," Emma said, her voice firm. "I want to be part of something that matters, that will have a lasting impact. If that's truly what you want, I'm willing to work with you." Victor nodded, his face serious but relieved. "That's exactly what I want. No more empty celebrations. I want to build something that lasts, something meaningful." They spent the next few hours going over the details, discussing how they would incorporate local charities into the events, how they could use Victor's resources to create opportunities for those who needed it most. It wasn't going to be easy, but Emma was beginning to feel a sense of purpose she hadn't known in years. This was her chance to not only reclaim her dreams, but also to help others along the way. As she left the meeting, Emma felt a sense of cautious optimism. She didn't know where this path would lead, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was walking towards something that could change everything. For her, for Noah, and for everyone she hoped to help. This was only the beginning, but it felt like the first step towards something far more important than any performance could ever be. Emma had the chance to rewrite the story, to create a future where music and compassion went hand in hand, and she was determined to see it through. The weeks following Emma's decision were a whirlwind of activity. Victor kept his word. His first event after their meeting was markedly different. There was still the glitter and glamour of the Ashford name, but there was a palpable shift in the air. Gone were the extravagant displays of excess, the mindless chatter, and the empty laughter that had once filled the mansion's halls. In their place, there was purpose. Emma's music set the tone for the evening, the soft melodies weaving through conversations, creating an atmosphere that was both warm and reflective. She had always known how powerful music could be, but seeing it bring people together in such a meaningful way filled her with a sense of fulfillment she hadn't known in years. It was clear to her, too, that Victor was sincere in his desire for change. There was no longer the cold distance in his eyes, no longer the man who had once used his wealth to manipulate and control. Instead, he had become someone who was actively working toward creating an environment where people could connect, really connect, with each other and with the causes they were now championing. Victor had started partnering with local charities and foundations, each event benefiting a different cause, from hunger relief to education for underprivileged children. The guests who attended were no longer just there to show off their wealth or indulge in frivolity. They were now part of something bigger, a mission to make a difference. And Emma could see the change in them too. The men and women who had once been dismissive of her, who had barely glanced at her when she played, now looked at her with genuine respect. They listened to her music as if they were hearing it for the first time, really hearing it. They came to her after each performance, expressing their admiration, their gratitude for what she had brought to the table. Not just musically, but emotionally, spiritually. One evening, as the final notes of Emma's performance hung in the air, Victor approached her with a thoughtful look on his face. The applause had just died down, and the guests were beginning to mingle again, but Victor stopped her before she could slip away into the crowd. "I never imagined this," he said quietly, his voice filled with something almost like awe. "I knew your music was beautiful, but I never realized the power it could have. You've changed everything." Emma hesitated before replying, her heart full of conflicting emotions. She had come to care for this new version of Victor, this man who seemed to be finding redemption, but she also knew that things couldn't be this simple. "I didn't change anything," she replied with a small smile. "You gave people a reason to listen, to care. You gave them a purpose." Victor's eyes softened, and for a moment Emma could see the man he had once been, the man who had lost his way, only to find it again through this new path. "I've never done anything that mattered before," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not really. Not until now. But it feels right, Emma, and I have you to thank for that." Her heart swelled with pride, but there was still a part of her that hesitated. Could she trust him completely? She had seen enough of his former cruelty to be cautious, but there was something different now. There was something real in his voice, a sincerity she had never expected from the man who had once seemed so untouchable, so unreachable. "It's not just me," she said, trying to ease the tension. "It's all of us, working together. We're just getting started." Victor nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I know, and I want to keep going. I want to do more. I don't want this to stop." Emma studied him for a long moment. She could see the hunger in his eyes, not for power or control this time, but for something more profound, for meaning. He wasn't asking for glory or accolades. He wanted to create a lasting change, something that would impact people long after the events ended. "I'm glad you feel that way," Emma said finally, "because I do too. But there's more we can do, and I think you know that." Victor's expression shifted to one of determination. "What do you have in mind?" Emma took a deep breath. "I want to take this beyond the parties, beyond the events. We need to create a foundation, something that will help children get access to music education, to the arts. We have the resources now, the influence. We can make a real difference in their lives." Victor didn't hesitate. "I agree. I've been thinking the same thing. Let's do it." And so, with that simple exchange, Emma and Victor began to build something new. A foundation dedicated to providing arts education to children from all walks of life. It wasn't easy. There were countless meetings, endless logistics to work through, and plenty of people who doubted their ability to succeed. But with every hurdle they overcame, Emma grew more and more confident that they were on the right path. And as Victor's support and commitment never wavered, she started to believe that maybe, just maybe, this could work. The next few months were a blur of progress. The foundation took shape quickly, with Emma helping to design the curriculum for a series of after-school programs that would teach music and the arts to children who couldn't afford private lessons. The first group of students was selected, and Emma poured her heart into every lesson, knowing how much this could change their lives. The joy of seeing their faces light up as they learned to play an instrument, as they found their own voices through music, was a feeling Emma had never experienced before. It reminded her of the very reason she had chosen music in the first place, to inspire, to heal, and to connect with others. Victor was there every step of the way. He made sure that the foundation was properly funded, that they had the resources they needed to continue expanding. He became a passionate advocate for the arts, using his platform to raise awareness and attract more donations. But even with all the success, Emma knew that they couldn't stop. There were always more children to help, more lives to change. One evening, as they celebrated the success of the first fundraising event for the foundation, Victor pulled Emma aside, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You were right," he said, his eyes bright. "This is what we were meant to do. Not just for the parties, not just for the glamour, but for something that will last." Emma smiled back, her heart full. "We're just getting started." And in that moment, she knew that everything had changed. Not just for Victor or for her, but for all the children whose lives they were touching. The transformation was real. The music they had begun together was resonating, and its echoes would continue for years to come. The mansion, once a symbol of empty power, had become a place where real change was being born, one note at a time. The foundation was flourishing, and Emma's life had taken on a new rhythm, one that was both invigorating and humbling. Each morning, she woke up with a sense of purpose that she hadn't felt in years, her schedule packed with lessons, planning sessions, and events to raise more funds for the foundation. Victor, too, had become a key figure in her life, not just as a benefactor, but as a friend. Their bond, once born out of obligation and circumstance, had grown into something deeper, built on mutual respect and admiration. But as the months passed, Emma began to realize that something else had shifted within her. The weight of the years she had spent giving up on her own dreams in the name of survival had begun to lift, and with it, the quiet longing for the life she had once imagined for herself, one filled with music and creativity, not just teaching, but performing. It wasn't that she didn't love what she was doing. She did, more than anything. But she had always harbored a secret wish, a dream she had buried deep down when life became too overwhelming. She had wanted to be more than just a teacher. She had wanted to be a renowned pianist, to perform on stages across the world, to have the chance to study at a prestigious conservatory and hone her craft. She had put it all aside for Noah, for her responsibilities as a mother and provider. But now, with the foundation thriving and Noah growing more independent, that dream started to resurface, like an ember rekindled after being buried in the ashes. One evening, after a particularly successful event where the foundation had raised a significant amount of money, Victor took Emma aside. His face was lit with pride, but there was something more in his eyes, something he had been holding back for a while. "Emma," he began, his voice soft yet determined, "you've done more than anyone could have imagined with this foundation. You've given these kids something invaluable. But I know there's more you want. There's more you deserve." Emma looked at him, confusion flickering in her eyes. "What do you mean?" Victor took a deep breath. "I know how much you love music, Emma. And I know how much it's always meant to you, even before everything changed. You've poured your heart into helping these kids, into building something bigger than any of us. But I think it's time for you to finally chase your own dream." Emma shook her head, uncertain. "Victor, I've been so focused on this, I can't just—" "Why not?" he interrupted gently. "Why not pursue your own dream? You've built something incredible here. You've changed so many lives, but I know you've sacrificed so much of your own. You deserve to have your own moment. You deserve to be who you were always meant to be." The words hung in the air, and Emma felt a swell of emotion in her chest. She had spent so long giving of herself that she had forgotten what it felt like to truly dream for herself. She had long given up the idea of ever becoming the pianist she had once envisioned herself to be. But now, hearing Victor's encouragement, hearing his belief in her, made something inside her stir. "Victor, are you saying you want me to leave? To go study? To—" He smiled, his eyes softening. "No, I'm saying I want you to do what you've always dreamed of, and I want to help you do it. I'll fund your tuition. I'll make sure you have everything you need. I don't want you to worry about anything. Just focus on your music. You deserve it, Emma. I'll support you in every way." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this. Not from Victor. She had always thought of him as a man driven by control, power, and his own needs. But here he was, offering her something she never thought she would get, a chance to reclaim her dream. Victor, I don't know what to say, she whispered, feeling overwhelmed. You don't have to say anything, he replied. Just say yes. Let me help you take the next step. You've helped me find redemption, Emma. Now, let me help you find yours. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at him, her heart full. She had always feared that the sacrifices she had made had been in vain, that her dreams were gone forever. But now, with Victor's offer on the table, she saw a path forward, one that could bring her back to the music, back to herself. Yes, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Yes, I'll do it. I'll go back to school. I'll follow my dream. Victor's face lit up with joy, and he reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. You won't regret it. I'll make sure of that. And just like that, Emma's dream began to take shape once more. She enrolled in a prestigious conservatory, the same one she had once only dreamed of attending. The thought of leaving Noah, of finding time to balance school with her responsibilities as a mother, was daunting, but Emma knew she had to try. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the chance to finally live for herself and to rediscover the passion for music that had once been her lifeline. Noah, ever her steady support, understood without needing many words. He was growing older, more independent, and though she would miss their daily routines, she knew this was an opportunity she couldn't pass up. I'm proud of you, Mom, Noah said one evening, his small hands wrapped around her fingers as they sat together on the couch. I know you're going to do amazing things. His words filled Emma with more strength than she had expected. She smiled, brushing a stray lock of hair from his face. Thank you, Noah. I'm doing this for both of us. The first day of school was nothing like she had imagined. It wasn't the smooth transition she had hoped for. Emma was older than most of her peers, and it was intimidating to be back in an academic setting after so many years. But the moment she stepped into the practice rooms, surrounded by other talented musicians, something deep inside her clicked. This was where she was meant to be. The years of struggle and sacrifice had led her to this point, and she was ready. Her professors were skeptical at first, unsure of how a mother and older student would fit into the rigorous environment. But Emma's dedication and raw talent soon spoke for itself. The more she practiced, the more she immersed herself in the world of music. The more she felt like the woman she had always been deep down. Her performances, once filled with self-doubt, now became confident and graceful. She was no longer playing for survival or approval. She was playing for herself and for the dream that had never truly died. She was reclaiming her place in the music world, and nothing felt more fulfilling. Victor continued to support her from afar, checking in with her progress and always offering encouragement. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. With each passing day, Emma grew more confident in her path, and as she honed her skills, she began to understand just how far she had come. From the young woman who had once buried her dreams for the sake of survival, to the accomplished pianist she was becoming. The next step was closer than ever, and Emma knew that nothing, no matter how difficult or uncertain, would ever stop her from reaching it. The dream she had once thought impossible was now within her grasp. It was a crisp autumn morning when Emma stood outside the conservatory, her hands clutching the strap of her bag, watching as students younger than her flowed into the building. Their laughter and chatter echoed in the air, and Emma's heart raced. She was one of the older students now, surrounded by people whose lives were just beginning, while hers had already been marked by years of struggle, sacrifice, and dreams deferred. But as she walked through the grand entrance of the conservatory, a sense of calm washed over her. This place, this world, felt like home. For the first time in years, Emma felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. The intimidating atmosphere of a prestigious institution faded into the background as she focused on the one thing that had always been her true passion: music. The first few weeks were challenging. The coursework was demanding, and Emma found herself struggling to keep up with the younger students who had years of training under their belts. Her fingers, which had once danced effortlessly across piano keys, felt stiff and out of practice after years spent away from the stage. But she refused to give up. Every night, after her classes and her responsibilities as a mother, she would lock herself in her small practice room and play for hours. She poured every ounce of herself into her music, channeling the frustrations of her past, the love for Noah, and the dream that had remained unspoken for so long. Slowly but surely, her skills began to sharpen. The notes flowed more naturally, the chords struck with precision, and her confidence grew with each practice session. It was in these late-night sessions that Emma began to see the music as a reflection of her own life, full of tension, but also filled with beautiful resolutions. Every time she struggled with a difficult passage, every time she stumbled over a note or a phrase, she reminded herself that she had always found a way to keep moving forward, no matter the obstacles. This was no different. Noah, too, was growing into his own person. The quiet, contemplative boy who had once clung to her hand at events now came home from school with a spark in his eyes. He was adjusting to the changes, finding his own rhythm as his mother pursued her dreams. They still spent every evening together, even if Emma was too tired to do more than sit with him as he did his homework and she practiced. One night, after a long practice session, Noah came to her, holding a piece of paper in his hands. His wide eyes were filled with excitement. "Mom, look," he said, unfolding the paper to reveal a drawing of a grand concert hall, with rows of people sitting and a piano in the center. The drawing was filled with vibrant colors, and on the piano bench, there was a small figure with flowing hair, clearly Emma. "I drew you, Mom," he said shyly. "I drew you playing in a concert. I know you'll make it there someday." Emma's heart swelled with emotion as she looked at the drawing. Her son had always been her greatest supporter, even in the darkest of times. His belief in her, his confidence in her dream, was something that fueled her more than anything. "You believe in me, don't you?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Of course, Mom," Noah said with a smile. "You're amazing. You'll be the best pianist in the world." Her throat tightened, and she pulled him into a hug, holding him close. For a moment, the weight of everything she had been through, everything she had sacrificed, seemed to melt away. She had already achieved more than she ever thought possible. And with Noah by her side, she was ready to reach for the stars. As the months passed, Emma found herself not only excelling in her courses, but also beginning to gain recognition for her performances. Her professors started to take notice of her raw talent and her dedication. One of her instructors, a renowned pianist herself, took Emma under her wing, offering her guidance and even recommending her for various masterclasses and performances. The dream Emma had once thought out of reach was now becoming her reality. But it wasn't just her musical growth that was beginning to flourish. So was her relationship with Victor. Despite the distance between them, Victor's responsibilities with his foundation, Emma's rigorous academic schedule, they kept in touch. Their conversations had shifted from business matters to more personal exchanges. Victor would send her encouraging messages after her performances, and Emma would share her progress with him, always feeling a deep sense of gratitude for his unwavering belief in her. One evening, after a particularly difficult concert where Emma had been invited to perform at a small recital hall in the city, she found herself on the phone with Victor. She had just finished a challenging piece, and as the applause echoed in her ears, she couldn't help but feel a mixture of satisfaction and anxiety. "Victor, I don't know how to explain it," she said into the phone, pacing the empty dressing room. "The performance was great, but there's still this nagging feeling that I'm not doing enough. I'm not where I want to be yet." "Emma," Victor's voice was steady, comforting. "You're exactly where you need to be. I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but look at how far you've come. You've made it through so much, and every step you take brings you closer to where you belong. You're not just performing, you're transforming your life, and that's something no one can take from you." His words resonated deeply with Emma. She had always been so focused on the destination, on achieving the recognition she'd dreamed of for so long. But now she was learning to appreciate the journey, the small victories, the moments of growth, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that every effort was worth it. "I guess you're right," she said softly, a smile creeping onto her face. "It's just hard to see it sometimes, but I'll keep going. For Noah, for me, for everything. You've got this, Emma," Victor said, "and I'll always be here supporting you. You've already done something incredible. Now let's see where it takes you." As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Emma's life began to feel like a beautiful, harmonious melody, one she was finally able to play with ease. She was no longer just a mother or a teacher. She was a woman reclaiming her dreams, a pianist finding her place on the stage, and a mother who had set an example for her son of what it meant to never give up on the things that truly mattered. And through it all, she had learned the most important lesson of all, that dreams, no matter how far out of reach they may seem, are never too far to chase. With hard work, dedication, and the support of those who believed in her, Emma was finally living the life she had always dreamed of, and it was more beautiful than she ever could have imagined. The years seemed to stretch before Emma like an intricate melody, each note, each chord, adding a layer of meaning to the story of her life. Her journey had been far from easy, but it had been filled with triumphs, small victories, and the kind of growth that only comes from perseverance. Emma stood in front of the large mirror in the recital hall, adjusting her dress for what was to be a life-changing performance. The room was still, the air heavy with anticipation. Her fingers trembled as she lifted them, recalling the journey it had taken to get here. She glanced at Noah, who was standing beside her, his face alight with excitement. He had grown into a confident, thoughtful young man, full of promise. His once small hands, which had clung to hers for comfort and guidance, had now grown to play the piano with a grace that surprised even her. He had begun to take his lessons more seriously, inspired by his mother's path. Emma had always known that his love for music would grow as his bond with her deepened. But the sight of him sitting at the piano, his small hands playing pieces with the precision of a seasoned pianist, filled her with an emotion that was beyond words. Noah's dream was becoming a reality, just as hers had. She had set out to inspire him, but it was clear that he had become her greatest source of inspiration. As she met his gaze, she knew that everything she had endured was worth it, just to see him stand here, proud of both of them. "Mom," Noah said quietly, his voice full of wonder, "I can't believe we're here. This is everything you've worked for." Emma smiled and ruffled his hair. "No, sweetheart, this is everything we worked for. You're part of this too. Every step I've taken has been because of you, your love, your belief in me." The recital hall, filled with guests from all walks of life, was a testament to how far Emma had come. A far cry from the parties she had once served as a waitress, the guests here were there to celebrate the beauty of music, to contribute to charitable causes, and to witness the incredible bond between a mother and her son. These were not just wealthy patrons. These were the people who had supported Emma throughout her journey, who had come to respect her for the depth of her artistry and her unshakable dedication. Victor was in the audience tonight, as he had been for the past few years. He was seated toward the back, his presence calm and reserved, his eyes focused on Emma with an intensity that spoke volumes. He had remained a constant figure in her life, not just as the man who had helped open doors for her, but as a friend who had become a guiding light in her transformation. His investment in her, both professionally and personally, had given her the chance to build the life she had always dreamed of. Yet, he never sought to take credit for it, never expected anything in return. When Emma had first walked into his life, unsure of where her path would lead, she had no idea that it would result in this moment, the culmination of years of hard work, of challenges, of sacrifice. It wasn't just about the piano or the recognition. It was about the freedom she had earned, the new life she had created for herself and Noah, and the understanding that sometimes the dreams that seem impossible can come true. The program was about to begin, and Emma's heart quickened as she took a deep breath. This was the moment. She had poured her soul into every note she would play, into every performance, every lesson, every choice that had led her here. Tonight, her music would tell the story of resilience, of love, of second chances. The lights dimmed, and the soft hum of anticipation filled the air. Emma stepped onto the stage, Noah by her side. She could hear the sound of applause that grew louder with each step she took toward the piano. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of everything that had led to this moment. She had once thought she would never be here, never be good enough to play in front of an audience like this. Yet, here she was, standing on the threshold of a new chapter. Noah took his seat next to her, the two of them poised together, ready to share the music that had connected them for so many years. Emma felt her heartbeat steady as she placed her hands on the keys. The first notes filled the air, clear and true. The audience was captivated, their eyes fixed on the duo at the piano. Emma's fingers moved with grace, each stroke of the keys a testament to the journey she had taken. The music flowed like a river, one that had begun years ago when she was a child, learning to play in a small room, full of dreams that seemed too distant to reach. And yet, here she was. Noah, too, was a part of the melody, his hands joining hers to create a harmony that felt as natural as breathing. Their music intertwined, their hearts beat as one. The audience watched in awe as mother and son performed, their bond evident in every note they played. The music was not just a performance, it was a declaration. It was a promise to never give up, to always fight for what mattered most, and to cherish the moments that life offers. The final chord resonated through the hall, and for a brief, fleeting moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. And then, the applause erupted, deafening, overwhelming, and filled with admiration. Emma's eyes welled with tears as she turned to Noah, who had a proud smile on his face. They had done it, together. As they took their final bow, Emma felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Gratitude for her son, for the love that had carried her through every challenge, and for the second chance she had been given. Gratitude for Victor, who had believed in her even when she hadn't believed in herself. And most of all, gratitude for the music, the constant thread that had bound her story together. The world outside the concert hall was still full of uncertainty and challenges. But in that moment, Emma knew that whatever came next, she was ready for it. She had already built a life filled with love, purpose, and the music that would carry her through the rest of her journey. The applause died down, and Emma and Noah stood hand in hand, facing the audience. And as they looked out at the crowd, Emma knew that this was just the beginning. The world was full of possibilities, and with Noah by her side, there was nothing they couldn't face together. A life reimagined indeed. As the final notes of their performance still echoed in the air, Emma and Noah stepped off the stage, hand in hand, leaving behind the world of darkness and silence that had once suffocated them. It was a new world now, filled with possibility, the kind of world Emma had once believed was out of reach. But through the love and music they shared, she had discovered that dreams, no matter how impossible they seemed, had a way of finding their way into reality. Years later, Emma's name would be known beyond the concert halls, beyond the small cafes where she had once played for tips, and the grand estates where she had served as a shadow in the background. She had become more than just a pianist. She had become a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of a mother's love and the strength of the human spirit. Noah, now a young man with a gift that mirrored his mother's, would follow in her footsteps, his own journey as a musician beginning to unfold. The bond between them remained unbreakable, a reminder of the sacrifices, the struggles, and the unwavering belief they had in one another. And Victor, too, had found his redemption. No longer the cold and distant man he once was, he had used his wealth and influence to support countless causes, ensuring that his legacy was one of giving rather than greed. Emma, ever grateful for the chance he had given her, had long since forgiven him for the cruelty he had shown her in the past. People change, she had come to understand, and sometimes redemption takes longer to find. But it was never too late. The music still played on, alive in the lessons she taught, in the notes her fingers danced across the piano, in the love that filled the house she shared with Noah, where the sounds of laughter and song never ceased. Life, Emma had learned, was not just about reaching the end of a journey. It was about embracing each moment along the way. The struggles, the triumphs, the people who come into our lives and change us, they all add to the symphony that is our story. And for Emma, that symphony was far from over. In the quiet moments when she and Noah would sit together at the piano, creating music from their shared history, Emma would smile, knowing that they had built a life worth living, and that the future, whatever it held, was bright, filled with promise, and waiting for them to write the next chapter. And so the music continued, their song still unfolding, a melody of hope, of love, and of the beautiful unpredictability of life. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to and follow this story until the very end. I hope Emma and Noah's journey has touched you deeply and offered valuable lessons about love, perseverance, and the power of music in life. If you enjoyed the story, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video so you won't miss any of our upcoming stories. Your support and feedback mean the world to us and keep us motivated to create more great content. Thank you again, and see you in the next video.